Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Welcome to 2023. It's our first session of the year, and we will be hearing planning for sustainable energy production, a nature-based approach to large-scale solar. For any questions that you have related to the presentation, whether it be technical issues or content questions, just go ahead and enter those into the Q&A, and we will get to the content questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And I will ask, if your question is for a particular panelist, please state it within your question. That just helps us. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a consortium of divisions, spearheaded today by the Sustainable Communities Division. So we thank this interdivision group for joining us again this year and for sponsoring today's session. You'll hear a little bit more about this series coming up here in a moment. Our upcoming webcasts, we have, actually, we're booking now into April. So head over to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for these and all of our upcoming sessions. They are on Fridays from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. Today's session is worth 1.5 AICP CM credits, and of course, your sustainability and resilience credit is also available to you. Head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number. And both the title and event number are available on our website in case you're having trouble locating them on the CM page. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you're on social media, please like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I post a reminder of our weekly upcoming session, and I also post when upcoming sessions are now available for you to register for. And head over to YouTube, subscribe to our channel. We record all of our sessions, including today's, and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over there and you'll see we have well over 400 recordings available for you to view for free. With that, I am going to turn it over to Carla, who is going to kick things off and talk about the SNR series a little bit. So Carla, it's all you.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Carla Ebenbach with Ebenbach Consulting based in Miami, and I'm also chair-elect of the APA Sustainable Communities Division. I'm happy to present today's session. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the series and encourage you to keep attending and to get involved. The series was created to provide opportunities for planning professionals to broaden and deepen their knowledge on these subjects and allow them to, of course, earn the mandatory AICP Sustainability and Resilience credit live or on demand. And we are so thankful to Christine and the Planners webcast series for partnering with us to bring the series to life. The series recordings are a permanent library of resources available for free, thanks to the dedicated efforts of fellow professionals donating their time and expertise to make presentations and organize events. Now available on the YouTube playlist are sessions on extreme weather trends, climate science and planning, the relationship of climate resilience and public health, technology tools, federal funding tools, electric vehicle infrastructure development, and a primer for planners on the basics of climate adaptation and mitigation. And you can follow the link here to find them. Today's recording will be available there next week if you have any colleagues who might like to see this. And there are more exciting sessions with top-notch professionals in our field in store for the year. Next week at the same time, we have Planning for Equity, Supporting At-Risk Communities and Regions That Flood. In March, we have 2 events on the schedule already. March 17th, Advancing Large-Scale Climate Resilient Projects Through Planning and Financing with HUD and DOT Perspectives. And March 24th, The Climate Planner, Strategies for Engaging on Climate When It's Challenging, with an author from Dover Cole Associates, and a number of other sessions are under discussion for the year. So if you're interested in working with the series, please reach out to me and I'd be very glad to talk to you more about it. Okay, next slide, Christine.
And if I may interrupt briefly and say, I put in the chat box for everyone the direct link to the playlist of the SNR series, so you can bookmark that.
Great. So you are about to hear Planning for Sustainable Energy Production, a nature-based approach to large-scale solar. And today's session is going to provide very useful information on how to move forward with this important technological response to meet our energy needs with this while minimizing greenhouse gas emissions, and doing so in a way that gives back to the natural setting rather than diminishing it. You'll have, as you know, opportunity to ask questions, and there will be a few polling questions that will help us to get to know you better and your needs. Next slide. Our panelists are experts on this subject, and I'll let them introduce themselves more fully, but we're going to hear from Brian Ross, who is Vice President with the Great Plains Institute, and also Jake Galsky, a researcher in the Department of Soil and Water and Climate at the University of Minnesota. So I want to thank you again for attending, and Christine, I'll turn it back to you to kick things off.
All right, Jake and Brian, it's all you.
All right, thanks, Christine. I will start sharing my screen if I can get to the right place. Okay, and then the question will always be whether you're seeing the presenter view or the presentation view.
Did you hit display settings and then swap up at the top left?
Okay, top left display settings.
Display settings and then swap.
Swap. Okay.
Perfect.
There we go. Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you. We're here to talk about a very important issue that probably more and more of you in the planning world are facing, which is how do you deal with large-scale solar development as it comes to community? And I'm going to spend a little time on some background on this to kind of bring up a common foundation of knowledge for everyone. And then we're going to talk specifically about one recent study that was completed that my co-presenter and I were involved with, the PV Smart project, which deals with one strict nature-based approach. And then I'll talk a little bit after that about some of the burgeoning other research that is in place to help communities do better planning for and integrate nature into large-scale solar development. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Brian Ross again, and I'm with the Great Plains Institute. We are a nonprofit organization that has the humble mission here of accelerating the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, economy, and environment. We have a variety of different programs that we work on that across all different kinds of technologies. We do work nationally. We've been around about 25 years now. I am the Vice President of Renewable Energy, hence you're going to hear me talk about a lot about solar energy. And I'm going to start with a kind of what is bringing about this whole issue, and that is as we're in the midst of seeing a big transformation in our electric energy system, as well as other energy systems, toward clean energy. And the background of this is that in the historic energy system, communities typically did not have to address directly energy generation. They were primarily recipients. There were a few places with centralized power plants or fossil fuel resources where there was a lot of mining or processing that kind of the brunt of the energy system. In the clean energy transition, though, what we're looking at is that almost all communities in the nation are going to be host communities of some kind. So we have to start rethinking this about how we as planners deal with the clean energy transition. And the start of this is to talk a little bit about kind of the reason this is happening. There is a perception sometimes that we have this clean energy transition going on now because of a lot of policy, which is in fact coming into play. But really what's happened is that it's a market-driven, it is now a market-driven response. What we have, just to give you a brief demonstration, these are the wholesale energy costs of levelized energy costs of utility scale generation. And you can see that back in 2010, it was quite expensive, and it has gone down dramatically in time over the last 10 years, over this decade. And wind energy, which was already starting to become affordable in 2000, has continued to become affordable, as you can see. But now wind and solar are actually about at the same place. And by comparison, levelized cost of energy for something like the natural gas combined cycle natural gas plant, which was in 2010 the cheapest way to produce energy, is now more expensive than both wind and solar. And something that's coal, which was a dominant part of our nation's energy portfolio in the past, is actually one of the more expensive ways to produce energy now. And as a consequence of this, the reason I'm showing all this is that help people understand that when they see renewable energy develop in their community, this is really a market-driven response at this point in time. It's not just that it's clean energy, it's that it's also the lowest cost energy for the electric system. And this is something that is a rather complicated graph, but I did want to show it because it shows two things. One is that the kind of transformation of in our nation's energy portfolio of new generation. It used to be dominated primarily by coal and natural gas, kind of became dominated by wind, and now by wind and solar together. This graph is showing all of the new projects that are proposed and asking for interconnection to the grid. From a planner standpoint, this is like all of the development projects that have gotten to the point in your community where somebody's actually come into the planning staff and asking for a pre-proposal or a pre-submittal meeting with planning staff because they've secured a site and financing and they want to move ahead. This is the same thing of what energy developers do on the grid. So, and you can see two things here. One is, as I noted, that wind and solar energy have emerged as the overwhelming choice for new generation capacity. If you look at on the right-hand side of that graph, where the green, orange, and yellow are solar and wind energy projects, but also that there is a monumental increase in just the volume of megawatts or gigawatts of renewable energy being proposed. The number of projects that were actually in the queue, in that kind of development queue, in 2021, at the end of 2021, was 845 gigawatts, which probably doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but just to give you a reference point, the total amount of electric generating capacity in the country of all types were in operation in 2021 was about 1,100 gigawatts. So you can see that the proposed new projects are actually 75% of the total existing projects. That's a market response as energy buyers are looking both for cheaper energy, and energy utilities are looking to replace what have become uneconomic assets like coal plants, more affordable assets, which are wind and solar. On the solar side of that, though, in terms of if we looked at the total proposed projects, again, looking at this from the standpoint of a planner in a community, the proposed projects of solar would result in about 5 million acres of land being needed to develop those projects. And that's just what's in the pipeline as of 2021. A lot of those projects, as with all development, won't actually end up getting built, but it's an indication of the market demand. This is what the market is demanding. This is what the development community is responding to that in. And this is why many of you are seeing solar projects cropping up in your communities. And the result of that is we're seeing some pushback. This is something that as the kind of land use transformation is going around, there are communities being asked to host the energy system of the future, the clean energy system, and it's a land use change, and it's creating different difficulties for some people in their communities. And so we're seeing a lot of difficulty of this development projects, these kinds of development projects moving forward, and communities wrestling with how to make this kind of development fit within their development priorities. And we hope to kind of help you address that now by to talk a little bit about what are the things that you can do through nature-based solutions to kind of avoid the controversy. But I wanted to start with a polling question, if I could, just to give a sense from people in the audience whether or not you're currently facing large-scale solar development in your community. And we have several different responses, everything from yes, we're seeing lots of multiple solar developments being built in our community, to no, we don't have any, and even we've banned them from our community. So be interested to see what folks want to do with the or what they're facing in their community.
So everyone, the poll is launched. I see, a lot of folks are already answering. To Brian and Jake, I don't know if you're able to see the poll or not. I don't know if it does. You can see it. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it, and it tells me that I can vote.
Oh, you can vote. How nice.
Mine says I
No,
can't.
no, it says I cannot vote.
Oh, you cannot vote. Oh no, let's see. That makes more sense. So I thought, how nice. They let you start voting.
I can't put my finger on the scale here. Come on.
Nope, you're not allowed. We'll give it a few more moments here. I'm telling you, the results. Can you see the results?
No, I can't see the results though.
No. Okay.
Yeah, we have done this kind of a polling before on questions over the last 4 or 5 years where we've been doing this work, and it is reflecting the market. We're seeing a whole lot more people kind of check the box on A than we used
wait
to.
till you see these results. All right, let's see here. I'm going to show the results. Can you see them?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It's all
All
over
right.
the board.
It is all over the board, and we have, but the most of the respondents are saying, of course, that multiple solar developments are built in our community, about a quarter of the people have seen no solar development in our community. And one of the messages that we're carrying here forward is that the solar resource, if you think of the solar resource as in the same way that you would something like oil or gas, every community in this nation has an economic solar reserve, if you will, kind of a reserve of energy. And if you haven't seen it come to your community, you probably will at some point in the near future. Yeah. So let's move on. And in that context, I always try to put my conclusions somewhere near the beginning of my presentation. So if I put you to sleep with the rest of the presentation, you only have to remember this one slide. And that is really, in the energy system of the future, nearly every community will become a host community because they have economic energy resources that people will want to take advantage of. Second is that most communities will have some land use jurisdiction over large-scale solar development, either exclusive control, as we see in about half the states in the nation, or some partial control in a state-driven process. And third, if sited and designed appropriately, large-scale solar can provide local benefits to host communities, consistent with your priorities, your resources, and your development plans. But it takes you as a community to make those choices. And one of the things that we want to do here today is to provide you with some tools by which you can make informed and better choices about how to make sure when these developments come to your community, they're actually providing local benefits, in this case, kind of ecosystem benefits or natural resource benefits. So in the world that we're going to talk about today is about stormwater first, because this is one that we have studied. And this is kind of a scenario that's seen sometimes in the development community as we move forward, where there is not a nature-based solution that has been adopted to control stormwater, which is kind of in contrast to the kind of thing that we can talk about today, where there has been a nature-based solution that has been put in place in order to address this particular ecosystem benefit. And that kind of thing that I've been talking about, I've mentioned co-benefits and ecosystem benefits. I wanted to kind of define that a little bit for you, because one of the things about development, of course, is that it has a specific purpose. In this case, solar energy is to produce clean energy for the wholesale grid and large-scale solar. But there are co-benefits that can be directed to the community, and we use this term pretty extensively in our work. So I kind of wanted to define that, and I had to put this slide up here because this is out of the IPCC fourth annual assessment way back in 2007 about what are co-benefits as it relates to climate change, and they had this whole kind of series of categories of different kinds of co-benefits. Really, it's about policies designed to address greenhouse gas mitigation, also have other sometimes equally important rationales, and there's a breakdown, economic through political, institutional, lots of different categories. I won't ask you to memorize this slide because we like to present it in a more simple way, which is if you restore watershed functions in your community, or if you do something that enhances habitat, or it diversifies your agricultural base, or it protects your drinking water supplies, does it matter if it's a solar farm? That's what a benefit is. And sometimes we found that communities are more interested in the co-benefits than they are in the clean energy benefit. And that's where you as a community, you have choice about whether or not these things are going to come to your community or whether they don't. So we have a lot of different approaches to nature-based solutions. We went through an exercise in my home state of Minnesota back a few years ago, where we identified kind of what use cases for nature-based solutions in solar development. And we came up with a list of things, including surface water protection, drinking water protection in terms of groundwater resources, habitat development, restoration or protection, carbon sequestration and soil health in the soils that are underneath the farm. But the one we're going to talk about today is really the surface protection one as it relates to stormwater, and a particular project that Jake and I have been involved with called PV Smart, which stands for Photovoltaic Stormwater Management Research Testing. And it's really all about water quality benefits and how communities can address this in the development process move forward. And this project was really developed from the standpoint of the Department of Energy, where they wanted to kind of create predictable and transparent permitting on the water quality side for large-scale solar projects. And so really this is a national study that is focusing on construction, stormwater management, solar best practices, because obviously in the stormwater you have the construction phase and the post-construction phase. A lot of the general construction permit work that is frequently managed at the local level looks at the construction phase. We're not really talking about that except as it affects the post-construction phase. And so the components of this study was to kind of measure and model the infiltration runoff at solar sites under a variety of real world conditions. And we did that in 5 different states at 5 different solar developments all across the country, all different hydrologic regimes and soil types, and even different kinds of solar installations. And Jake will provide a little more background on that. We wanted to evaluate the current stormwater and water quality standards as they apply to solar. And so this is something that really looked in depth at the different kinds of stormwater regulations that we currently see and the different kind of permitting processes that solar development is subject to. And then finally, to create solar-specific compliance pathways for water quality regulation so that we achieve that predictable and transparent permitting. That was the reason that DOE, Department of Energy, funded this study. And the PV partners on this study are the University of Minnesota, who is Jake is representing, Great Plains Institute, who I'm representing, an organization called Fresh Energy, which did our communications work around the project. And then it was led by the National Renewable Energy Lab. They were the lead entity for the project. The specific problem on stormwater that we were trying to get to is really that jurisdictions with authority were treating ground-mounted PV facilities as in the same way they would other kinds of impervious surface in stormwater and water quality permitting, treating them effectively like a rooftop or a parking. Most of the stormwater models that were used to estimate stormwater runoff and determine what kind of best practices need to be put in place were based on research that had been done over decades, looking at different kinds of development, but none of the development had certain of the characteristics of solar development, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And so a lot of the regulations that were being applied to stormwater runoff on solar farms were relying on non-solar research and ultimately leading to higher costs for the development, usually slower deployment, because there was always an argument about what kind of research and what kind of science need to be applied. And even in many cases, poorer water quality outcomes, ironically, than you would have seen had you had solar specific standards. And so we wanted to solve this problem. We created a plan to do so, which is establishing a national water quality task force to oversee the project, conduct field research on infiltration and runoff at five different mounted PV sites in 5 states, and to use that research to create a 3-dimensional hydrologic model and generate a lot of stormwater runoff coefficients that are specific to solar development and solar farms. To then from that develop some water quality best practices specific to solar, and then to engage with local jurisdictions and state regulators and other stakeholders and the solar industry itself to disseminate these practices and runoff coefficients. So we are now in that final number 5 phase because we've completed all the other things, and we're going to present to you the kind of groundbreaking results of this study and some tools that are available to you as local planners who are frequently having to deal with things like stormwater in development sites to better make better decisions and to make better nature-based outcomes. Just to kind of give a word on our water quality task force, it did include people who had experience at the local and the state level in the regulatory arena. It included the solar industry, several different people from the solar industry. It included several water quality experts, including the Environmental Protection Agency and the people who were running the construction stormwater permit process nationally, as well as some advocates for water quality and some educators who are doing research on this. So we had a very broad group of people representing a lot of different perspectives. And ultimately, what we're trying to get to on all this is how we turn this into this, as I showed you earlier. And I want to point out that in these photographs, which I didn't say earlier, is that these 2 photographs are the exact same spot at 2 different points in time. The first photograph on the left is when this particular solar development was in the midst of a very large enforcement action by these state regulators because of a failure of them to achieve what they said they were going to achieve in their post-construction runoff. The photograph on the right is the nature-based solution that they came up with in order to solve that problem. So this is something that can be done on most sites and something that we want to kind of help you guys get to. And I am going to now move into the more technical part of the presentation and the training part, where we're going to talk about the PV Smart Solar Runoff Calculator that was developed as part of this, that's publicly available and usable by almost anybody. And Jake's going to talk about this. The whole goal was to enable developers and engineers and local decision makers, et cetera, to really have a common foundation of scientific knowledge and to be able to apply that in a way such that we're going to have better outcomes for host communities and a more transparent and predictable permitting process for developers, with the ultimate goal that we create partnerships around solar development and we accelerate the deployment for our clean energy future. So Jake, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I will stop sharing and let you take over.
All right, thank you, Brian. My name is Jake Galsky. I work at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to talk to you about the runoff calculator that we have created within this PV Smart solar project. The objective of this work is basically to put some science behind the best practices that we want to encourage for reducing stormwater runoff and improving water quality. As Brian said, we've been treating a lot of these sites as if they are rooftops or parking lots, and because there's not a lot of science behind studying these PV sites. So we wanted to put some science behind that, and we have created this calculator tool that will estimate runoff at these PV sites by accounting for a number of different factors. I'll go into each in detail, but the factors include soil texture, slope of the site, ground cover present, the size and spacing of the panels present, and finally the climatic factors that are involved at the site. So as Brian said, we've selected 5 sites across the country to try to get a wide variety of these variables as we could. Each site does have some sort of perennial planting or pollinator mixture underneath the panels, but besides that, they're all a wide variety of other variables, different soil types. We have different types of panels, we had fixed panels, we had tracking panels, different size of panels. And finally, we have New York and Georgia on the drier, or on the wetter side, and Oregon and Colorado were on the drier side of our site. So we tried to get a wide variety of all different types of hydrologic regimes, soil types, try to get a hold of what these variables are actually describing at these sites. We visited each site and installed the soil moisture probes at several locations. So we have 15-minute real-time data underneath panels, at the drip edge of panels, and in between panels in the soil to try and just track and characterize how water is flowing through the soils. I took on-site soil texture measurements, bulk density or compaction measurements, water infiltration measurements. And these are all to sort of feed into our hydrologic model, all these measurements. We used a model called Hydrus. It is a hydrologic model that simulates water flow through a soil. And it is a very detailed model that allows inclusion of soil profile, depth, texture, bulk density, just a wide variety of different soil characteristics to sort of track how this water is going to flow through the soil medium. So we collected data at our 5 sites. We have 2 years of data now, and we used that data the data I collected, we used to model these sites. So in this graph here, you can see the measured data in green for a 4-month period, and the Hydrus model is in red. And the table displays error values, which on the far right, the RMSE values, which are very small in context. They basically represent that our modeling is with less than a 10% difference than what we are measuring on the sites. So we have a very high confidence that this model is describing the hydrology of the sites very well. And these sites, as we mentioned before, are very complex. We have an impervious surface that's collecting precipitation, that's collecting on a panel drip edge, it's infiltrating in between panels, underneath panels, and it's also evaporating and creating a certain amount of surface runoff. So this bottom image is actually a screen capture of the model result. We have in the blue arrows represent this concentrated drip edge runoff, which the model can account for. It can account for incident precip or precip that's falling between the panels, but it also simulates this lateral water movement down the slope across the different soil profiles, and anything in the system that is not infiltrated is obviously out of the system as surface runoff. So this is sort of what the model has simulated, and why we chose it, because it can represent all these different complex interactions. Again, we think the model is doing a great job at describing the hydrology of these sites based on the data we collected. And some of the results we have, these are the largest factors that were most important in driving the runoff at these sites. And they're ordered here in order of most influence. So as one would imagine, the size of the storm has a very large influence on how much runoff would be expected. A 100-year storm would obviously have much more runoff than a 2-year storm. But some of the unexpected results that we noticed how important compaction and depth of a soil profile actually were. So a compacted soil versus a loose soil would experience almost a doubling of runoff, depending on other factors involved. But just compaction alone would cause almost an 100% increase in runoff. Soil depth had a similar, very large influence. If you look at a shallow profile or a depth to an impermeable layer, whether that be bedrock, shallow water table. I can get into that a little further too, but shallow water profile had a lot more runoff as well because you have less of a soil to infiltrate some of that water. The ground cover had an important influence. Row crops, we saw an increase in runoff about 40% when you compare that to a mature prairie. And then the final variables were the presence or absence of panels and also their spacing and size. They had a noticeable influence on how much runoff we noticed at our sites. So we also calculated, if anyone has heard of runoff curve numbers, it's a standard industry NRCS method that has been based on decades worth of data collected on basically predicting the runoff of a certain rainfall event based on the land use type. And it's limited to 4 different soil types, A, B, C, and D, which represent A, lighter, sandier soils, all the way to D, a heavier clay soil. So our modeling yielded 40% less runoff than these NRCS estimates. But we are also diving into a lot more detail than just putting them into 4 different boxes of soils, as I'll sort of get into next. So yes, this is a couple of screen caps from the actual calculator that we created. We knew it wasn't feasible for each user to download and run this complex modeling software. There's a giant learning curve. So I simulated over 1,000 different model runs with different soil textures, different depths of soil profiles, different compactions, different vegetations. And I cataloged all of the results, all of the runoff results into an Excel spreadsheet. And then using multiple regressions, we sort of created this hopefully easy to use instant runoff calculator where users can input their site-specific data and see what kind of runoff would be expected at that site. So a quick example, these are 2 screen caps of outputs of the tool. They are exactly identical except for soil texture in this case. So we have 2 scenarios where a silty clay is a sort of a heavier soil texture. It yields, with these other factors held constant, it yields a curve number of 59. A 10-inch rainfall event would you'd expect about half of that to come off as runoff. And in a loamy sand, which is a lighter soil, it allows sand would allow more infiltration. That gets knocked down to about 1.6 inches. So that's just an example of how a texture would affect infiltration in the quick glance at our tool. I was constrained to some assumptions based on the model that we used. All of these estimates, when I ran thousands of different scenarios, had to be where the panels are parallel to the slope of the landscape. In other words, they're installed along the contours of the landscape as opposed to up and down the slope. That was so the model could route flow off the panels, infiltrate it between the panels and underneath the next panel. Also, there's a few other assumptions here. The panels are at maximum tilt, maximizing runoff. The soil beneath it is free from snow and frost, and vegetation underneath is fairly uniform distribution. And the intent of our tool is to have planners such as yourselves be able to explore different scenarios, whether that be pre-construction. You can look at what the influence of having presence or absence of arrays, different vegetation types, what that might yield. And maybe you can explore a number of different sites that you have as potential sites, and maybe site where you would expect less runoff based on soil texture or soil depth. We also can explore post-construction characteristics. So we can start to explore different mitigation measures that might help offset some of the increased runoff that a solar PV array would experience. So in this example, we have on the top, we have no solar panels present in a row crop scenario. On the bottom, we have installed solar panels. We put a newly established pollinator underneath it. And then we also simulated this ripping effect, or some sort of tillage that loosened the soil before the pollinator was established. So as you see here, by installing panels with a mitigation of this soil compaction, we can actually reduce the amount of expected runoff that we're going to see from this site. So as Brian mentioned earlier, this is just a co-benefit that if these things are placed with great management practices, they can yield several benefits to the local landscape. Another factor we found important was the rooting depth. If anyone's familiar with soil terminology, it's analogous to rooting zone depth, depth to a restrictive layer, whether that be a water table, clay pan, bedrock. It's data for all of our inputs on this tool are nationally available for the entire country based on a Surgo database. It's a database of soil data. Obviously, we want you to use site-specific data if you have it, but we have a user manual included with this tool that you can look up these values if you don't know them for specific sites. So again, with the screen caps, we have all other variables remaining constant. We change the rooting zone depth from 2 feet, so a deeper soil, we would expect 5 inches of runoff from that 10-inch storm. The shallower soil profile has over 7 inches. So the more soil, the deeper the soil you would have, the more infiltration capacity it has to handle some of these rain events. You can play with ground cover types within our tool. So this is both helpful for pre and post construction. We sort of have them ordered here in least infiltrative to most. You can simulate bare soils or gravels or certain row crops, but also down to newly established pollinators and prairie lands. And if you do use the tool and are playing around with ground cover types, as opposed to the scenario I described earlier, the change of vegetation internally changes soil bulk density values. So if you want to figure the influence of changing a newly established pollinator to a turf grass, no other bulk density mitigation taken place, the simple conversion from a pollinator to a turf grass would increase runoff, from this 5.3 inches on the left to 6.5 on the right. So again, if you're playing around with vegetation, the details are in the user manual, but we want you to leave these bulk density values alone unless you're mitigating them or simulating some sort of mitigation from soil compaction. So in conclusion, we've hopefully developed what we believe is a user-friendly tool. You can simply find these, again, nationally available soil parameters and a couple other different parameters that you should be able to play with at your site. Soil texture, depth, bulk density, vegetation present. And it allows planners such as yourself to explore a variety of different variables at these installations and quickly identify which or what the stormwater impacts could be. We have other people that have beta tested this model and they use it alongside, or they take these curve number values and plug it into different models. They swim or HydroCAD models, but it can be used as a standalone, just a scenario exploring tool. As planners like you, and like I said, hopefully we created a tool that's somewhat straightforward to use. And I believe I have a link to the tool itself. I believe it's going to be put in the chat at some point. So this bottom link here, it's a free license through the university. It's a free tool to use. It's a simple Excel spreadsheet, and you can just click through the drop-down menus and start to explore different scenarios. And again, this site also has a user manual attached to it. So if there's any questions on the detail of the minutia, you can kind of read into that through the user manual.
And Jake, I did post it in the chat, the links to everything and to the series recording. And I did get some messages in the questions box that it was disabled. And so I have now undisabled it. So
Okay.
you should be able to see it. If not, I will keep working on it, but folks seem to be able to see it now.
Okay, that concludes my section. If I believe I'll throw it back to Brian, and he'll get into some more detail on the management practices and some future work we have planned.
All right, thanks, Jake. And I've been kind of monitoring the questions as we move forward, and there's a lot of really great questions. Some of which we'll have to throw to Jake at the end of the presentation. So, okay, are we seeing the right thing, or do I need to switch again?
You're good. Oh, no,
Okay.
switch.
Oh, I got to switch again. Okay,
There you go.
there we go. Okay, so and some of the questions I did in the that have been posted are that that Jake's presentation was pretty technical, and indeed it was. We want to make sure that people who are technical kind of understand that this is a very serious project, and has gone and taken some pretty extraordinary steps in order to be scientifically valid. I'm now going to talk about what people like me who don't run hydrologic models would need to see out of this search in terms of things like writing ordinances. And we developed a document that is based on all of the stuff that Jake just said, and all of the models that have been run by the scenarios or through the calculator. The scenarios run through the calculator in order to create some kind a portfolio of practices for solar projects, things that will help local governments in particular, but even state regulators who actually have access to hydrologic models, to kind of understand what are the things that need to be addressed in order to capture the kind of nature-based solutions benefits at the local level of these projects. And so we have basically, we have in this document, which you see here, in which Christine, if you can put the link up in the chat for this document as well. I will say that this audience is the first to actually see this particular document. We are launching it today. So hopefully people will be appreciative of that. I'm appreciative to get it out to people. But basically, these best practices are really kind of on the premise of, if you cite in terms of your location of where you want to put solar farms in your community and design appropriately, solar development can offer community some significant nature-based solutions, specifically to water quality problem risks. And what the best practices are categorized into 4 different kind of buckets of best practice that follow exactly the findings of our study that Jake just went over. And that is, the 4 buckets are: first, reduce or eliminating compacted soils in your solar development. The second is testing and designing for soil depth as part of the solar development process, to be able to account for and recognize where there's opportunities and where there's potential problems. The third is to establish native or naturalized deep-rooted vegetation as ground cover, which has the benefit not only of the water quality benefit, but also in many cases of creating creating buffer areas to existing habitat, or enhancing the performance of existing habitat creating new habitat. There's been a lot of studies done ongoing about pollinator, the increase in pollinators that you see on these sites in places where they have been somewhat decimated. And then the final one is designing for disconnection, which is a stormwater term, but really to understand that these sites provide the opportunity to do a lot of infiltration in ways that most development cannot. And we need to make sure we're designing that into our ordinances and into our regulations that we're moving ahead with for these projects. So just to kind of go into a little bit more detail on these four buckets of best practice. Compaction is one that Jake has kind of described, that if you have compacted soils versus uncompacted soils, it can increase runoff by as much as 100%. So what does that mean in terms of kind of what you would look for as a local regulator or in your ordinance? You want to emphasize LID construction practices, low impact development. That's something that in water quality worlds and infrequently in water ordinances has been utilized already, but it has some particular impacts about on the subject of compaction, making sure that construction equipment and the staging plan that you use, the limited grading, the kind of things that are in your SWIP or the stormwater pollution prevention plan that has to be filed are addressing these things. That if you have post-construction, after the construction is done, you need, if you have, it turns out you still have compacted soils, you need to decompact them, plow, chisel, scarify to decompact soil, etc., to a threshold standard that is acceptable, which requires the developer to document through measurement of bulk density, for which we provide some standards in these documents. You want to seed this between clearing and construction in order to minimize the compaction that would occur during those times. And then finally, you want a post-construction operations and maintenance plan that ensures that you're not going to be running heavy equipment or things over your land that will actually reduce or increase the bulk density, decrease or increase compaction, and result in less infiltration than you had planned for. So that's kind of, that's a summary of compaction best practices. The document that we have provides more detail on that if you want to take a look at that. Another question that comes into play, and this is something that actually, to our knowledge, is not measured almost anywhere in the nation as a stormwater issue, which is soil depth. One of the advantages of a solar farm, because it has so much vegetative cover on it, is that you can use the soil to infiltrate. But if you have very shallow soils, then it's like a bucket, right? How much can you put in your bucket? You have a very small bucket and you have a 10-inch storm, it's going to overflow. Knowing that in advance helps you design a system that's really going to protect the community and provide water quality benefits. So practice site selection and design that reflects your post-construction soil depth. If you have sites that have good soil versus sites that don't have them, you want to discourage the shallow soil depth sites. You want to make sure that you're incorporating soil depth into whatever stormwater or water quality modeling you're doing in order to understand really what the opportunities are. So a lot of local communities won't do modeling, but it is something that you can ask the developer to do, because frequently the developer will do the modeling, or it's required to be submitted as part of the construction process. And then to look beyond the design storm and meeting minimum standards. What this means is that frequently we look to kind of minimum standards that if you can infiltrate a 1-inch storm, for instance, then you've met the standard and we don't have to look any farther than that. And what would be the idea to get to nature-based solutions is to say, let's make sure we're accounting for storms that may exceed that 1-inch storm, that we're the kind of minimum threshold standard, to see if we're actually creating a water quality amenity on site. Ground cover is one that has been addressed by some communities already. And it is really based on recognizing that different ground covers, as Jake has described, have different levels of infiltration and as a consequence, different water quality benefits that flow to the community or are provided to the community. and recognizing that in your ordinance or in your management of stormwater BMPs in the development process. Encouraging or supporting use of deep-rooted and native vegetation ground cover. This is something that is really important. A deep-rooted native vegetation has two great impacts. One, or several great impacts actually. One of which is that deep-rooted ground cover allows for a much greater infiltration. It also helps reduce compaction over time, even if there is heavy equipment that is run over it. And then finally, use of native and deep-rooted ground cover creates co-benefits other than water quality. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, things like habitat, things like even visual impacts are dramatically changed when you use a native ground cover that provides, for instance, flowers during the summer, or that if it's designed correctly will provide vegetation cover over longer periods of time. And increasing the greater diversity and sustainability of your native ground cover and recognizing these kind of visual habitat and visual co-benefits, something that you should take advantage of in your local or in the state regulation of these projects, and to encourage developers to kind of adopt these practices as well. And then finally, the disconnection is really about making sure we treat the ground between these panels and under the panels as an asset, establishing a minimum disconnection distance, focusing on the distance, particularly when you have shallow soils where you don't as big of a bucket, you might need a little bit more disconnection, and to use disconnection explicitly as management practice if modeling shows that it is helping to mitigate runoff from the site. This is a parenthetical, what we've noted, most solar farms, the disconnection distance between the arrays is already sufficient because they don't want one panel to shade the other one. For most sites, it would probably only be in special conditions where you might have steep slopes or you might have shallow slopes or higher levels of compaction that you would want to kind of use disconnection probably over and above what the developer would probably want to do. So this kind of leads us to the question of, can we use solar as green infrastructure? We go beyond the kind of, are you complying with minimum standards, and actually saying that we're going to offer a nature-based solution that extends beyond the site itself and helps communities achieve other kinds of water quality goals. And one of the reasons we ask that question, and this is not always true, but most solar development occurs in rural areas where agriculture is the primary land use. Agriculture is exempt from the Clean Water Act, and as a consequence, we are constantly struggling in our things like the impaired waters work that locals do, or if you have a TMDL that you're dealing with in water quality regulation, to throw a few terms out that hopefully some people are recognizing here. How do you address that in particular if you have a lot of agricultural land uses? And solar development actually can help agricultural land uses mitigate for some of the runoff problems that you might otherwise see crops or other kinds of agricultural systems. Impaired waters and TMDLs, which stands for total maximum daily load, which is something that many communities have to deal with when they are in their own stormwater permitting processes. It really helps you achieve those protection goals. And it takes a watershed approach to community benefit. What we've actually seen in a few cases, not very many, is that where there is a community that has, for instance, a solar farm or a stormwater, or I'm sorry, wastewater management facility that is out of compliance with Clean Water Act regulations, and they're facing phosphorus limitations, for instance, that have to be mitigated by construction of a lot of new infrastructure on site, that there was, in a few cases, a solar farm that was being done just upriver in the same water body, and the solar farm was using pollinator habitat and native habitat and using the best practices that we've outlined here, and they actually over-complied with their own site restoration, and in a water quality trading regime, actually was able to trade the benefit that they were achieving down to the community downstream, immediately downstream, so that they didn't have to spend as much money in terms of their wastewater plant upgrade. And the surface water, the river in these, was in fact the phosphorus limits or phosphorus levels were going down. So that's kind of the green infrastructure category. And now I wanted to have another survey question that talks about whether or not these terms were thrown around and the kind of level of water quality work that you do in your community actually apply. So we asked them a question, does your community need less impaired waters or other water quality standards? Yes, we have impaired waters, and we are an MS4, which is a municipal separate sewer. I always get lack on the number of S's. It's if you have a stormwater system that you have to get a permit for from the federal government. No, we're not a community that has to deal with that. But C is we have other water quality standards, maybe at the state level, that we have to address, or you can simply say, I don't know, what's an MS4? So.
And for those, right now we're sharing the results. We just started using Zoom at the end of last year, and I didn't realize that all of the survey questions popped up at the same time. So everyone kind of responded at the same time, but I am still sharing. I am sharing the results there, and it's because I just wrote a paper on this municipal separate storm sewer system.
There you go. Thank you. Yes.
I literally have it in the background.
Okay.
On my computer.
I stumble over it all the time.
You should. It's crazy.
Yeah. Okay. So
Anyway,
it's
so
good.
can you see those results, Brian?
Yes, I can. And
Okay.
that's good. So we're actually talking to, the majority of communities here actually have to deal with these water quality issues. So if you think of this as a watershed wide issue, the kind of solar farm development, this comes into play for things like your MS4 permit or your TMDLs. So anyway, that's good to know. Okay, but let me move on. And because I want to talk briefly, because we're essentially out of time here, about the next step in this process, which is a new study that we are launching that is also Department of Energy focused, to take the work we did on water quality, extend it further, and to also address other kinds of ecosystem benefits, and to create a tool that can similarly be used by local governments to make sure that solar development is serving local needs, and to help solar developers kind of be in a better position about documenting what the impacts of their development are and are not to the local government. This new study, which is going to be launched in April, is really filling gaps in the scientific record on a variety of ecosystem services that are solar specific. So we're going to be doing a lot of more field research, that as technical stuff that, as Jake described, on a variety of different things, including soil health, carbon, soil and carbon, and groundwater, extending the surface water work, and we'll also be addressing existing research on things like habitat. We're going to be directly engaging the potential framework users, which include local governments and regulators, as well as tribal governments separately, in shaping the research. And then we're going to examine it across different kinds of ecosystem priorities, recognizing that energy transition companies and rural communities and urban communities and tribal communities may all have different kinds of priorities that we need to address and study. And then finally, and this may be of particular interest to this audience, we're going to be recognizing the critical role of cultural services that are part of ecosystem services that frequently create the issues and barriers in the community to solar development. And kind of the way we look at this, we have this wheel that kind of has the four different kinds of services that are provided by under the rubric, under the portfolio, the umbrella ecosystem services, and what they mean and what we're doing here. And so kind of the cultural element of that, which I did want to kind of make sure I emphasized, these are things like view sheds, aesthetic concerns, recreational concerns, in some cases even spiritual concerns of what happens to the natural environment when you do a solar farm, and to kind of really engage the communities directly in how they see the risks of solar farms, as well as potential mitigation efforts that we can take and build into our our development process for the solar developers to understand what's a pathway that is going to help mitigate for things, for instance, like visual impacts. Will be visual preference surveys, as well as understanding the kind of cultural, agricultural risks to communities. The regulating services that we'll be looking at include things like soil carb, measuring phosphorus in the soil, which is has a potential groundwater impacts, and whether or not we can use solar sites to actually sequester carbon over time and improve soil health. And the supporting service, which is really more focused on the soil health, is a particular gap in the scientific record that we're going to be examining and incorporating here. And then, of course, recognizing that solar energy itself is a service that's being provided here, an ecosystem service, and we want a solar-driven framework that's going to help people. We will be creating national best practices that will be a web-based illustrated guide on how to implement these things for local governments, and identifying specifically the priority cultural services we can address in this in order to enable stakeholders to really have pathways for implementation that matter to them. So I have now I want to ask, I can do this final survey question, or we could just move straight to questions. Christina, what do you want to do? Or maybe people already answered this.
Yeah, yeah, they did. So I just shared them anyway. Just it'll, only take a second.
Okay, well, there we go. So I asked the question of what kind of ecosystem service is most important in your community. And not surprisingly, since I am a planner and I kind of have been through this before, viewshed and rural character is the one that comes up most frequently. And we will be explicitly addressing in this forward-looking study, as well as these other elements: agricultural lands, groundwater, and habitat vitality. So, and I will let you know now, though I don't have a mechanism to capture names. My contact information will be available to you. We will be forming some guiding committees and subcommittees. And if there are people who want to participate in this study, it is primarily going to be focused on the West here. There was a separate study that's looking at the Northeast in a very similar manner. But I'm happy to kind of consider, if you have an organization or you as a planner want to participate in the kind of ongoing work here, I'd be happy to get an email from you and have you let me know that we can do this. So thank you very much for the time you've given us. I know there's a lot of really great questions that I'd love to have some time to address on the topic area, and I'll hand it to Christine.
There we go.
And I'll
So
stop
Jake,
sharing.
if you want to, now I'm here. If you want to jump back on, Jake, we'll see how many of these we can get to. All right. So the first one that came in, I'm frustrated with large scale solar fields taking up swaths of wildlife habitat. We need to find a better way to combine solar energy with working land, such as solar panels on working agricultural crop operations or over parking lots on buildings. Maintenance is key. How do we ensure that we as planners and decision makers are aware and minimize impacts of these development activities on wildlife habitat and connectivity?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we emphasize, and I have a whole nother presentation I do on local ordinances for this stuff. We emphasize 2 points. One is that the local government has control over siting as well as site design. I mean, when the local government has the authority over large scale solar, which is not true in every state. And the question about whether or not solar is impacting the existing wildlife areas is a siting question. Most communities have said we don't want to see solar on wildlife areas, and you actually have, as a land use authority, the ability to do that. And we would recommend that. That's something that is always a hugely unpopular thing to do. It undermines the existing ecosystem benefits you're getting from that land, and we'd recommend that you kind of either discourage or prevent solar farms from going on existing wildlife areas. The things we're showing here are how to actually create wildlife on solar sites where it wasn't before, and that's what we really want to emphasize. So that's kind of the big picture answer, I think, there. And also, it is important on the maintenance question that you not only require that habitat be established or encourage habitat to be established on the site, but also that it's maintained over the life of the project. That's another kind of performance standard that you should take a look at.
What is the average size of a solar field? How many
Average.
acres?
Yeah.
Or is there such a thing? Is an average even a thing?
Well, I will give you two ranges. We see this happen in two different kinds of developments. One called community or solar gardens, and one called that we kind of refer to as solar farms, right? Or utility scale. Community scale solar is kind of where it is going to cover anywhere from a couple of acres up to 20 or 30 acres in terms of development. Utility scale development is where we're talking about developments that are in the hundreds or even thousands of acres. So those utility scale developments do get very big. Now, we actually have a site in Indiana that is appropriately called the Mammoth Solar Facility. And it is a huge facility. The total project footprint is like 12,000 acres. The actual amount of ground cover that is going to be covered by the solar array area is probably only about 2,000 acres, only 2,000 acres. So there's a lot of kind of space between the different array areas. But those are kind of typically what we would see for a utility scale development is something between, I'd say, 500 and 1,500 acres for utility scale.
Okay. So I'm seeing a trend of questions here. How does this fit into my community? So there's questions coming through like, I'm a built out community. How do I play into this? Or, climate related, whether you're in the desert or you're in the mountains or you're, get a lot of weather, you're coastal. I'm sure that there is an ideal location for a solar panel to be, have the maximum efficiency. But how can these communities start looking at, well, how can I play into this if I'm built out? Or how do I play into this, if I live in a coastal community that has a lot of rain or something, so how do we look at that?
Yeah, well, and I'm going to address a couple of those things. Then I'm going to hand it to Jake to talk about things like the applicability of this in desert environments or in places where there's, extreme, lots of rain, kind of very wet environments. A fully built out community is not going to see a utility scale solar farm. I mean, that isn't going to happen. A built out community may still see some opportunities for community scale solar where you have some sites where they can't easily be developed with other kinds of things, but they could accommodate a 500 kW solar farm, which is going to take maybe 2 or 3 acres of land. We also see some kind of buffer areas around things like, even in built communities, buffer areas around wastewater treatment plants where you can actually put these kinds of things. So there are opportunities, or on airports. Built out communities may still have an airport, or one adjacent to them, and those are actually great places for solar, and the FAA has standards to allow that to happen. So there are opportunities for the community scale in most cases, even in built out communities. And in those communities, and I actually happen to live in one of these, where there really isn't much of an opportunity for that, then we certainly look to things, and which is a whole nother presentation, but we look to things like, how do we do this on surface parking lots, which take up a huge amount of space in built out communities. And there is an opportunity to do that, as well as, of course, on rooftops and other kinds of development. I want to hand it over to Jake now and have him address the kind of the applicability of this to places like desert environments and very wet places.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to our tool and how it works in these places, since we've cited some of our sites are in our Colorado and Oregon sites, I believe, are 16 inches of annual precip, so they're on the arid side. So I would assume in the desert landscape, the tool and the runoff predictions would perform fairly well because the model worked in our arid sites as well as it did in our wet sites. It's above my pay grade to say if it's a good or a bad place to put it, but I can speak to how the tool would predict runoff in those locations, and I would expect it to perform well as the other sites that we have. So
Okay.
Yeah, and I will say that we actually had somebody, a county in New Mexico that is doing exactly that, was very eager to use the tool and actually sat down with, I think, Jay, and actually said, how does this work, and had a, and it turned out to be very useful to them.
Yep, and they were actually concerned in those desert climates. There's a lot of quicker, higher intensity storms, not just a 24-hour period. So the runoff curve number method allows, it's a standard method, so you can take those values and shrink it down to a 1-hour storm segment and start to predict different runoff estimates from the higher intensity, shorter storms as well.
Okay, so we've talked about bringing solar panels to our communities. So let's look at the other end of the spectrum. What's the shelf life on one of these babies? And at the end of its tenure, what do we do with them?
Okay, great questions. And obviously we're not in this nature-based solutions thing, we're not addressing directly things like decommissioning and the like, but I'll be happy to touch on it. For solar panels have a rated life, up to 80% of their rated output of something like 25 years. So what we typically look at is the assumption that a solar development is going to have a shelf life. Yeah, I'm gonna have to write that down, Christine, and say what is the shelf life of one of these babies? It's about 25. The land leases sometimes extend beyond that because solar developers do look at, once the panels get to a point where they want to replace them, whether or not they will repower the system. And the community does have some say over that. There are actually communities that will issue an interim use permit for 25 years. And at the end of that 25 years, they can reevaluate whether they want to repower the system, allow for repower, or if it has to be decommissioned. The decommissioning process on a solar farm is relative to other land uses is very straightforward. There's no foundations in most cases. There are buried electric lines frequently that you have to say whether you're going to pull them up or not, but it's actually a very forward process. The bigger question about decommissioning has been usually not at the local level, but kind of at the broader, more stable, is what do we do with solar panels and similar things, and that is still something that is talked about being resolved. The industry is moving toward recycling. The recycling capacity right now is not within the industry needs a ways to go before we can say that we have the capacity to recycle the panels. The materials out of panels are actually very valuable. If we have a recycling process, there is a market for them, and the bulk of the volume and the weight of waste products from solar facilities is the glass, and that is something that's recyclable.
We a couple of years ago, at least here in Ohio, we had a couple counties that had some solar developers come through, and it didn't end well for the communities. They were kind of bullied into a lot of things, and frankly didn't really know a lot about large scale solar fields at the time, which it's a good thing these types of topics are coming up now so that we as planners can be more prepared for, when companies and developers are coming in and suggesting this. What are some of the things that planners should know when a solar developer might be coming through their community? And I think I would probably say communities that might have quite a bit of land available.
Yeah, solar developers are developers, right? I mean, like any other kind of developer, and the fact that they're doing solar doesn't make them holy, nor does it condemn them. And so if you just think about a solar developer as a developer, it's the same kind of questions you have to ask other kinds of developers. And there are solar developers that are very responsive to communities and some that are not so. Just like a housing developer, right? I mean, it's the same deal. You need to be prepared. You need to understand that they have an economic interest in what their goal is to create a project. And I would say, have a portfolio of things that you want out of that particular development, and some of which are kind of the nature-based solutions that we talk here. But to know that those things are all possible and can have a negotiation with the developer in a reasonable way. And most of the developers, I mean, we talk a lot to developers as part of this study. They were part of the project, and most of them are very supportive of these kinds of best practices and the kind of nature-based solutions. There are some places where it increases their costs more than others. And then that's where you're going to probably see some pushback. And I think there was a question kind of also about different parts of the country are seeing different kinds of development. We are seeing, for instance, in the Midwest, where I'm from, almost all of the development is occurring on agricultural lands, which has consequences that planners need to deal with. On the East Coast, we actually see an increasing amount of development that's occurring on forested lands. That changes the dynamic. It's a different kind of development. And from a water quality standpoint, it's very different. I mean, that you can't really come up with a better land cover for water quality purposes, forest. You can come up with a much better water quality land use than corn. So, the kind of baseline you're looking at in terms of what the impacts are to your community, you need to be cognizant of that. And I think developers are willing to work with the community on that, provided you have those goals that you want to achieve in advance, kind of identified, so that the process is transparent and predictable. That's really where we want to go.
Okay, this is a good one. Have either of you received inquiries or worked with land trusts or land preservation programs in the effort to find land for solar projects? I've seen community efforts for addressing climate change and energy strategies to approach land trusts and land preservation programs and use preserved land parcels, preserved for natural open spaces and ag land, to install solar installations. Have you worked with any of these trusts or programs before?
Oh yeah, this is like it turns out this is a softball question. Just yesterday, I was on the Land Trust Alliance national workshop or national work group on renewable energy, in which I participate in monthly. And there's a whole series of land trusts from across the country who are talking about exactly these kinds of things. There are some land trusts who have actually taken interesting steps, such as participating in solar developments by making sure by actually holding a conservation easement over the solar development land that identifies the pieces of that land that they want protected and not developed, but allowing solar development on the other pieces of the land. So there's actually an example of that, and I should remember the specific land trust where that was. I think it's in North Carolina. But I could probably look it up. But they actually wrote a conservation easement that specifically says, here's where solar is going to be allowed on the trust land that we hold. So you can do it. And in fact, it's a very interesting kind of use case. But we are in discussions about this, and the kind of land trust, larger national land trust community is actively participating in these discussions. And we've invited them to participate in our ecosystem service study. So.
I was thinking about this question too, and I've seen it now a couple of times. There's some questions about like the height of vegetation and how often it needs to be mowed and sort of the maintenance of that. Can you just speak a little more to that?
Sure, and this is really getting some of the details that the solar developers and the owners of the site, which are not sometimes the same people. A lot like any developer, a lot of times a solar developer will develop and then sell. I mean, just like a housing development, right, or a commercial development. Sometimes a solar developer will develop and keep, or there are people in the industry who don't develop, they only own and manage. And so the kind of where the costs come down kind of gets a little tricky. It is more expensive to build a solar development with a pollinator kind of habitat, establish it, than to not do it. But the long-term maintenance benefits are that you actually have, once it's established, and that's a key thing, once the ground cover is established, you have to mow it less frequently. And mowing, as it turns out, is a really big cost to someone who's owning a solar farm. In fact, a lot of people who buy solar farms are quite disturbed after they've bought it at how expensive it is to do mowing. And when you have turf grass, you have to mow it a lot more frequently than you do if you have a plan for it and established a cover to do it. Now, there is also kind of on the downside of that, obviously, if you have, a lot of the 24-inch vegetation on the ground that you have to move to in order to swap out a solar panel, it becomes a little bit more, it's a different situation. That's a lot less frequent, or has a lot less cost associated to it with most maintenance than the kind of ground cover maintenance costs that we see over time. So so there is this trade-off. The height of the vegetation and the height of the panels that are only 18 inches off the ground, you have fewer options to do native ground cover than you do a panel that has a 24-inch or a 30-inch minimum height. That affects that's the development costs. It affects the maintenance costs. All these kinds of things are in play all the time.
Someone just typed in and said, use goats or sheep to reduce the vegetation. And we actually had a webcast on that a couple of years ago, where you could actually rent goats to, help the vegetation on the sides of highways and things like that.
Yeah. I will say I am a carrying member. I like to say this. I'm a card-carrying member of the American Solar Grazing Association.
So that's a thing. Okay.
Yeah, it's a thing. You didn't even know there was a Solar Grazing Association. There is a thing. And there are actually a lot of people out there who use, solar farms either as feed for their sheep, or they treat their sheep as a mower, and they basically provide a service to the solar farm owner.
Yep. We have to wrap up, but I'm also seeing a couple things about using closed off landfills as potential bases for solar fields, and golf courses too. I'm seeing that have closed down, for those at least that perhaps are developed out, particularly for the golf courses. That might be.
There's some there's good opportunities there. Brownfields is tricky to do, but there are people who are doing it. So
good. All right. Well, we have to wrap up. A couple housekeeping items to leave you with. This session has been recorded, is being recorded. We'll post it onto our YouTube channel on Monday. I will be grabbing the slides from you, Jake and Brian, if you could both email them to me so that I can get them up on our website also on Monday, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. That's where you can get links to all the things you need, all of our upcoming sessions, recordings, slide decks, just all the things that you need, you will be able to find there. So thanks to you both, Jake and Brian, and of course to you, Carla, for coordinating the interdivision group that hosts this series. And we thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great exploration of solar panels, and everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.